What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some games with some great post-game content, which is a video that was suggested to me, actually, the last time I made a video about New Game Plus titles, and as usual, it sounded pretty fun, so I thought, why not? And obviously, here we are. But a couple of things. It's always interesting when you roll credits on a game, only to find out that that game is not actually over, that there is more to do. But even with that, some games obviously do this better than others, just very generally. However, I think it's also important to make a couple of distinctions. For starters, just because you can continue playing a game after the story is over doesn't necessarily mean that what you're doing is considered post-game content. An easy example of this would be like the Elder Scrolls titles. As an example, the main story is a relatively small part of those games. However, once you've finished it, even if you do it like immediately, there's still tons of stuff to do in the open world itself, but that stuff isn't really post-game content. It was always there. You just didn't access it immediately of your own volition. Whereas what I'm talking about is more that there is content that is only available once you have initially beaten the game, and also is not really New Game Plus. That is obviously a distinction I wanted to make from that initial video that I made, but also because those are two different things. New Game Plus cycles are good, and I think sometimes they can generally be part of what you might consider a post-game. Like, for instance, I think in the case of a game like Neo, as an example, you could argue that the New Game Plus cycles kind of are the post-game. But again, just not really what I'm talking about here specifically, just so you're aware of kind of the focus of this particular video. With all of that said, I wanted to go ahead and dive into this. But to kick it off, we actually have a bit of a repeat in the sense that I want to mention Dragon's Dogma again, which is actually a game that did feature in that video about New Game Plus titles, and that's because Dragon's Dogma does actually have some pretty fun stuff it does with New Game Plus. But what's more than that, it also just has a really good post-game at the same time. You see, once you've rolled credits on the initial Dragon's Dogma, that is to say you've defeated the dragon and returned victorious, things have changed, actually. Especially around Grand Soren, where a huge chunk of the city has been completely destroyed and has opened up into what is called the Everfall, a sort of post-game dungeon you can participate in, which has a whole bunch of unique stuff that's a little much to explain here, but nonetheless does some cool things. However, that's really only a piece of it, because once the dragon's dead, the entire world kind of shifts and changes. You can be attacked by the guards in the main city once you are declared an outlaw, at least in the noble quarter specifically. There's also new quests and stuff that open up that deal with the aftermath. A bunch of the NPCs have necessarily moved thanks to the destruction of parts of the city, that kind of thing. So there are huge changes to the world itself, and that's without even mentioning the DLC content of things like Bitter Black Isle, which technically isn't post-game content, but is something you would probably do around this time. And so basically, there is a ton of content that just beating the basic version, so to speak, of Dragon's Dogma isn't going to show you, which is always nice, as there is a lot more to do and see, and challenging fights to partake in. But for our second entry, there is one game I wanted to mention as to what I think might probably be my favorite post-game in video games, and that is actually Red Dead Redemption 2. A game that I love, but unfortunately don't get a ton of opportunities to talk about all the time, but it's perfect in this particular instance because Red Dead Redemption 2 has an incredibly impactful post-game where after, and spoilers by the way, from here on out, Arthur Morgan's untimely demise, you then switch to playing as John for a section, which sets up the post-game and also bridges the gap between the prequel of 2 and, of course, the beginning of the first game. And while that's great narrative stuff that kind of shows you what happens there, it also, outside of providing even more story content in the form of effectively like an entirely new chapter of the game that happens after the game is over, it's actually not all of it. You see, there's a bunch of stuff that Arthur may not have finished, and you can go do that stuff now as John, and that usually includes snippets of like unique dialogue that react to the shift, which can be unique in its own way, but ultimately you can complete everything you didn't do as Arthur, plus all this unique content that is only now available. And then to top it all off, once you've finally done everything there is to do in the single player, which is a significant amount of content, there is actually a pretty touching scene where you can go to visit Arthur's grave after that, and hear a few unique lines of dialogue before saying goodbye to the game itself. I loved the post-game in Red Dead Redemption 2. May well wind up being one of those games I go back and revisit for a review at some point because it was one of my first ones, but nonetheless, fantastic. For our third entry, something entirely different, and unfortunately something I'm not going to have a lot of footage for because it is Pokemon Gold and Silver. the second generation of Pokemon titles, and while not my personal favorite of the third generation, I think the second was actually really great. One thing about it that people may or may not remember, I suppose, via its remakes of things like Heart Gold and Soul Silver, but that I remember as a kid because it was probably one of my first experiences with post-game content, is that after you go through the new Johto region and then defeat the Elite Four and everything, get all the badges, the usual stuff, you're actually not quite done if you don't want to be, because at that point, the entire original Kanto region opens up, and you can go play what is effectively a second Pokemon game, completing all the badges and doing everything that is unique there. Which includes a lot of the original content that you would expect, but also sometimes like advances time and shows off like different stages of the various gym leaders and stuff's lives. And once you're done with all that and you've seen everything else that's new, you can actually head up to Mount Silver and have a sort of final battle against Red to really finish out the game. And I think it is just fantastically well done even to this day compared to many other games. And while I've always had a bit of a soft spot for Pokemon, admittedly because of much of the time in which I played it, I really enjoyed doing that as a kid, so much that even these days it sticks out as a really great memory. But we're not quite done yet, because then we have the Sea of Stars, another game that I think does post-game really fun, though to be fair, you could probably fill this entire list with JRPGs if you really wanted to in some form or fashion, and I imagine I'll get a lot of comments to that effect. But I wanted to talk about Sea of Stars in particular, because there's a bunch of stuff that opens up after you beat the game for the first time. Namely, everything you need to do to get the true ending, because when you beat the game for the first time, the ending you get isn't bad or anything. But if you're paying attention, there's some allusions to things that have been left undone. And what they're referring to are the many things that you can now do in order to unlock the true ending. Some of this is more involved than others, but this is going to lead you to things like new bosses, new content in general. One of them's a little boring. You have to collect all 60 rainbow conches as an example. But once you've done all of it, you can go back and fight the last boss again, only to be met with the actual ending to that game that you don't have to play through the entire thing again for, which is honestly the part that I liked. So all of that is well and great on its own. But I would be remiss not to mention here that there's actually more than that now, because thanks to a free DLC that launched, I think earlier this year, actually back in April or May, there's even more post-game content in the form of a new expansion that has been again added for free called Throes of the Watchmaker, which adds an entirely new section of content that's pretty sizable in length, has an entirely new set of systems and mechanics and things, takes place in a different part of the world, and is pretty compelling all on its own, which is obviously why I wanted to mention it. A very cool little update that I think makes the post-game of Sea of Stars, which was already really good, that much better. Which is obviously why I wanted to mention it. But to wrap up this particular video with a final entry, there is one more game I wanted to mention, because I haven't talked about it in a little while, and that is none other than 2018's God of War. A game that I liked overall a bit more than Ragnarok, I would say, but not least of which because of how I think it handles its post-game content. Because while God of War does have things like a New Game Plus, which is a great time to try out the Give Me God of War difficulty as an example, which can net you some unique shield skins, there's also just a lot of stuff you can do in the post-game anyway to, I would say, hone your skills, perhaps before giving that a try. Now, the obvious one is doing things like hunting down the Valkyries and having the fight with the Valkyrie Queen, which is very well known. But there's also other stuff, like the Trials of Muspelheim as well as the Realm of Niflheim, each of which can provide a pretty unique experience where you have to either complete unique challenging trials or escape the poison of Niflheim before the time runs out, that kind of thing. And that's on top of the fact that some of the areas in which you have been traveling actually change and everything after the game is over, potentially opening up some entirely new stuff alongside new areas that weren't available previously to begin with. Then there's all the quests and stuff that you can now do because they're available finally, just as an example. So while I think it's an easy game to overlook in this regard, I think one thing God of War actually does really well is providing a lot of engaging content outside of the story, which I already thought was really great, by letting you continue to play and enjoy its fun combat system. And honestly, a lot of that is a good chunk of why I wound up enjoying it more than Ragnarok, I think down to things like, pacing and just the overall flow of combat. But none Nonetheless, there have been 5 games whose post-game I think was really great and enjoyable, and with any luck, you'll agree. But whether you do or do not, I would love to hear about some games down below that have a post-game you particularly enjoy. Like I mentioned, I expect a lot of JRPG mentions, and I'll be a little disappointed if I don't get them. But naturally, that means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.